The rise and fall of Ravi Zacharias. For nearly 50 years, one man stood in front of kings, senators, scientists, and skeptics and told them he had the answers to life's hardest questions. He filled arenas. He debated atheists at Harvard and Oxford. He was called, by some of the most powerful voices in Christianity, the greatest offender of the faith in a generation. But 4 months after his death, the organization he built opened its doors to outside investigators, and what they found would unravel everything the public thought they knew about him. This is not a story about a verdict, because there was never a trial. It is a story of a legacy, an investigation, and the questions that remain when the man at the center of it all is no longer alive to answer them. Ravi Zacharias was born in 1946 in Chennai, then known as Madras, in southern India. He grew up in a middle-class family shaped by both British colonial influence and deep Indian tradition, in a household where faith was present but, by his own later account, distant. As a teenager, Zacharias would later say, he attempted to take his own life, and it was in the aftermath of that crisis that he described a spiritual turning point, a moment of faith that redirected the course of his life. It became the founding story he would repeat on stages around the world for the next 5 decades. In 1966, his family immigrated to Canada. Zacharias enrolled in ministry training, and within a few years he was preaching internationally, first through evangelistic crusades, then through his own growing platform. By the 1980s, he had found his true calling, not simply preaching to believers, but engaging skeptics directly. He wanted to stand in university lecture halls and debate philosophy professors. He wanted to answer the hardest questions about suffering, science, and meaning on the enemy's own turf. It was a bold, almost reckless approach for a preacher, and it worked. But the young man who once stood on the edge of his own despair was about to build an empire that would carry his name and his image into the homes of millions. What no one in that audience could have imagined was how far that empire would eventually reach, or how completely it would one day come apart. In 1984, Zacharias founded Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, RZIM, with a stated mission of helping the thinker believe and the believer think. What began as a small operation grew, over 3 decades, into one of the most influential apologetic organizations in the world. He wrote more than 24 books, several of them bestsellers, translated into dozens of languages. Titles like Can Man Live Without God and Jesus, among other gods, became staples in evangelical households and seminary reading lists alike. RZIM expanded into more than a dozen countries, training young apologists through its own institute, and building a global network of speakers under Zacharias' direct mentorship. He addressed the United Nations. He spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast. He was invited into rooms most religious leaders never enter, briefings with military officials, private conversations with heads of state. To millions of evangelical Christians, Zacharias wasn't just a pastor or an author. He was proof that faith could hold its own in the most rigorous intellectual arenas on earth. But even as his reputation climbed to its peak, there were quieter moments, questions raised and set aside, that suggested the public image and the private reality might not be the same thing. In 2017, a woman in Canada named Lorian Thompson alleged that Zacharias had engaged in an inappropriate online and sexual relationship with her years earlier, while she had reached out to him for spiritual counsel during a period of personal crisis. Zacharias denied wrongdoing. Both parties eventually signed a confidential settlement, and a lawsuit connected to the matter was dismissed. RZIM, at the time, publicly defended him, describing the allegations as a case of extortion attempted against him. For most of the public, the story ended there. Zacharias returned to stage. His ministry continued to grow. Few outside a small circle of journalists and former staff members knew there had been any warning signs at all. It would be nearly 3 years before the full picture began to surface, and by the time it did, the man at the center of it would no longer be alive to respond. In early 2020, Zacharias announced he had been diagnosed with a rare form of sarcoma. Tributes poured in from around the world, from pastors, authors, and political figures who credited him with strengthening their faith or sharpening their thinking. On May 19, 2020, Ravi Zacharias died at the age of 74. Memorial services were held in multiple countries. Christian leaders across denominations mourned the loss of a man many considered irreplaceable. For a brief window, his legacy seemed settled, a life of global ministry, capped by a dignified farewell. That window was about to close, because what happened next would not just complicate Ravi Zacharias' legacy. For many of his former followers, it would upend it entirely. In September 2020, for months after Zacharias' death, new allegations emerged, this time from massage therapists employed as spa-owned by Zacharias in Atlanta. The claims were serious enough that RZIM's own board made an unusual decision. Rather than investigate internally, they hired an outside law firm, Miller & Martin, to conduct a fully independent inquiry. Over the following months, investigators reviewed electronic devices, financial records, and physical evidence. They interviewed more than 50 witnesses, including former RZIM staff, spa employees, and women who came forward with first-hand accounts. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for spending your time with us today. There are countless videos you could be watching, and we're grateful you chose this one. If you appreciate honest, carefully researched documentaries that focus on the facts, would you consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel? It helps us continue creating the kind of content you enjoy and allows more people to discover these stories. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to the investigation. In February 2021, Miller & Martin released its findings. The report concluded that Zacharias had used his position and reputation to exploit numerous women over an extended period, including several employed at the massage properties he owned, and that he had used ministry funds to sustain the properties involved. The investigation found that Zacharias had requested nude massages, engaged in unwanted touching, and asked women to pray with him while partially undressed, framing these acts within a spiritual context. It also found that he had taken deliberate steps to conceal these relationships, including through non-disclosure arrangements. It is important to be precise here. These were the findings of an independent civil investigation, not a criminal court. Zacharias was never charged with crime, and he died before any of these allegations became public or could be directly answered by him. But the scale of what investigators described, spanning more than a decade, involving multiple women, largely unknown even to those closest to him, was almost impossible for RZIM's own leadership to reconcile with the man they thought they knew. In a public statement, RZIM's board called the findings reprehensible and issued a formal apology to the women affected, describing the abuse of trust as a profound betrayal of the ministry's mission. For an organization built entirely around one man's credibility, there was no way to simply move past it. In the months following the report, RZIM's international branches began to distance themselves from the parent organization. Some renamed themselves entirely. Publishers pulled Zacharias' books from shelves. Universities removed references to honorary lectureships bearing his name. By 2021, RZIM's North American leadership announced the ministry would begin winding down its operations altogether, an extraordinary end for an organization that once operated in more than a dozen countries. Christian leaders across the evangelical world grappled publicly with what had happened, many asking the same uncomfortable question. How had warning signs, raised years earlier, been so thoroughly set aside? The case became a reference point in broader conversations about power, unchecked authority, and the systems, or lack of them, meant to hold religious leaders accountable to anyone at all. For the women whose accounts formed the basis of the investigation, the report was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long and painful reckoning, one that continues, largely outside the public eye, long after the headlines faded. For the millions who once found comfort, intellectual grounding, or renewed faith in Zacharias' words, his story now sits in an uneasy space between admiration and horror, a legacy that cannot be fully celebrated, and cannot be fully erased either. The case remains, for many religious organizations, a case study in what happens when an institution builds itself entirely around the reputation of one person, and what it costs everyone else when that reputation turns out to be only half the story. Ravi Zacharias spent his life telling audiences that truth matters more than comfort. In the end, it was an independent investigation, not a courtroom, not a confession, that applied that same standard to him. His legacy is no longer a single story. It is two running side by side, one of extraordinary influence and one of extraordinary harm. Both are now part of the historical record. Neither can be told without the other. What we choose to do with that record, how carefully we hold power accountable, and how seriously we listen to those harmed by it, may be the most important part of this story still being written.